This is how I like my Micro Four Thirds. Lightweight and compact. Hi guys, my name is Matti Sulanto. I'm a photographer. In this video I'm gonna be shooting on this tiny little Micro Four Thirds camera, which I think is almost like a hidden gem in the whole Micro Four Thirds lineup, including both Olympus OM system and Panasonic. There are a couple of really nice tiny little Micro Four Thirds cameras, the GM1 and the GM5, both of which are really sought after these days, which also reflects to their prices on the used market. And those prices, in my opinion, are pretty near obscene these days. And you might not be willing to pay those pretty near obscene prices. However, this little camera is also tiny. It has the same or even better specifications than either of the cameras I mentioned, the GM1 and the GM5, except for the viewfinder. So if you have to have that, I guess you have to get the GM5. This is the Lumix GX880. You can buy this for roughly half the price of the GM1 or the GM5, at least here in my geographical location in Finland. And this is exactly how I like my Micro Four Thirds cameras and lenses. And the lens, by the way, on this one is the Lumix 14mm f2.5, which is also kind of an underappreciated lens. I think this is a really fantastic lens, and as far as I know, this is the tiniest Micro Four Thirds lens with autofocus. A fantastic lens, especially on a tiny camera body like this. Depending on your geographical location, you might never have heard of the GX880. However, you might have heard of the GX800 or the GX850, or I think it's GF9 or something. And all those three cameras, they are pretty much the same camera as this. And I think sometimes Panasonic's model numbering is a little bit confusing because they have so many different model names or model numbers for different geographical locations. Now here are some things that I really like about this Lumix GX880 camera. The first, of course, is the tiny size, which I kind of already mentioned a few times. This camera is absolutely pretty much almost pocketable, especially with this 14 f2.5 lens. The next like is the tilt screen, which also goes to a selfie position if that's your thing. This is really nice for street photography, for example. I can shoot from the hip or waist level, and when I look down I can see what I'm doing, and this is, in my opinion, a big improvement over the GM1 or the GM5, which both have a fixed screen. This is really nice and convenient and very practical tool. Another really nice thing is the customizability. I have customized these two buttons on the top of the camera for both ISO and autofocus. So when I'm holding the camera on my waist level, I can use my left thumb to focus the camera, which is really nice, and the other button is really handy for changing the ISO setting whenever necessary. Usually I have it on auto, but in certain situations I want to have a manual control over the ISO, and then this button comes in very handy. Another nice thing is the touch screen. You can easily, for example, move the focus point around, because obviously there is no joystick on a tiny camera like this. Another like is the single autofocus performance. Now this camera uses contrast-based autofocus, so the continuous autofocus is not that great, but the single autofocus is super fast, silent, and very reliable. Silent with most Micro Four Thirds lenses. And another like is, of course, the lens lineup. We all know that there are so many Micro Four Thirds lenses available, and most of those lenses are excellent optically too. And you can mount any of those lenses on this tiny little camera. But I would not recommend this for telephoto shooting, or bird shooting, or something like that. This is not very like convenient or nice to hold if you have a really big and heavy lens on it. But with these tiny lenses, there are a few other relatively small lenses in the Micro Four Thirds lens lineup from both Olympus and Panasonic, and with these tiny lenses this is really almost adorable and almost pocketable too. And yet another like is the image quality, which is excellent. This only has 16 megapixels, so not quite as many as the latest Micro Four Thirds cameras, but other than that the image quality is essentially as good as on any Micro Four Thirds camera. And one more like is the solid build quality. Of course, no weather sealing for this tiny size and relatively tiny price, but other than that, excellent build quality, very nice in hand. Of course, no product is perfect, no camera is perfect. There are also some dislikes to this camera. Then the first is the continuous autofocus performance, which is not a surprise. This camera uses contrast detect autofocus, which is known not for being very good at continuous autofocus. However, for street photography, it's not usually a big issue because the single autofocus usually is sufficient. And even if you miss the focus by a small margin, the depth of field usually covers those minor mistakes, because Micro Four Thirds in general, and especially a lens like this, a 14mm lens, it offers so much depth of field in every situation, and especially on a bright sunny day like this, when you typically shoot at around a 5.6 or even f8. Another dislike is the lack of IBIS. Unfortunately, Panasonic did not put IBIS into their smallest cameras, whether they couldn't do it or didn't want to do it. I don't know which is true, but anyway, no IBIS here. And especially with the lens like this, you don't have any kind of stabilization, which is not necessarily a big deal for street photography. Most of the time you'll want to use rather short shutter speed to stop the motion in your pictures. But in any kind of situation where you would like to use a little bit longer shutter speed, you may want to use a stabilized lens. Another dislike is the ergonomics, which, to be honest, is not that great. The only command dial or only dial you have is the one here on the back, which feels kind of flimsy and too freewheeling, in my opinion. However, this camera is actually quite nice to hold, because there is a small grip on the front and a small thumb rest on the back. This does not require any accessory grips or things like that, unlike some other tiny cameras. So the most practical exposure mode is the P mode. You never have to actually touch the dial, just focus and hit the shutter. My other favorite shooting mode is the shutter priority, whenever I need to control the shutter speed. Other than that, the P mode, program mode, is fine. Both of these modes are relatively easy to control with only this one dial on the back. And speaking of the P mode, in my opinion, the camera behaves a bit weirdly when it comes to the exposure values it selects. See, the camera is very reluctant to go faster than 1/5000 shutter speed, which on a bright day like this makes the lens stop down really too far into the diffraction zone. And the reason, I guess, for that is that the mechanical shutter only goes to 1/500, and anything faster than that is with the electronic shutter. And for some reason, Panasonic engineers have decided to avoid the electronic shutter, which in my opinion is weird, because I don't see much problem with the rolling shutter or anything like that. The next dislike is the touch screen. Yes, it's very handy for moving the autofocus point around. However, it's very tempting to hold the camera like this when you are carrying it, because it's so tiny. But if you grab it like this and the camera is turned on, it makes the autofocus point move all over the place, and even sometimes the size of the autofocus point has changed to something that you would not prefer otherwise. So you pretty much always have to turn the camera off if you plan to carry it like this and you have the touch screen enabled. One more dislike is the smallish battery. I get it, it's a small camera, you can't fit a huge battery inside here, but sometimes I feel that the battery life is not that great, and I really want to turn the camera off whenever I'm not taking pictures. Fortunately, the power-up time is quite decent. You don't have to wait for like many seconds for the camera to turn on. So if you are looking for a tiny little Micro Four Thirds camera, but you also feel that the GM1 and the GM5 are obscenely expensive, I highly recommend you take a look at the GX880, GX800 or GX850 or the GF9, I think is the latest model. These cameras might not be quite as pretty as the GM1, which I agree is really pretty looking camera. But other than that, I think these are better than the GM1 and much more affordable. And also I highly recommend you to check out this 14mm f2.5 lumix lens, which, like I said, is in my opinion underappreciated. It's a really nice lens, especially for street and travel photography, because of its tiny size, and the 28mm equivalent angle of view is just about perfect for street photography. That's all I have for you this time. I hope you found this video entertaining, useful, helpful, and all that. Thank you so much. Hope to see you soon in the next one.